Episode 110, April the 24th, 1916. 5 miles of batteries fired at me. Destroyers crowded hour off the Belgian coast. By Taffrail. Read by Tim Walton. One of the best known and most entertaining writers on naval matters used the pseudonym Taffrail. This was Captain H.T. Dorling, D.S.O, R.N. retired, a naval officer who saw much active service during the Great War. The spirited action which he describes took place off the Belgian coast in April 1916, when he, as a lieutenant commander, was in command of H.M.S. Murray, engaged in protecting minesweepers and minelayers. Before playing his part in the World War, Captain Dorling had seen active service with the Naval Contingent in the South African War and in China in 1900, including the relief of Peking. I am never likely to forget Easter Monday, April the 24th, 1916. The depredations of enemy submarines in the English Channel and the southern portion of the North Sea were becoming a menace. The barrages of mines and mine nets between Dover and the French coast had done little to prevent U-boats from proceeding down channel and doing their worst. Many of the marauders, minelayers among them, hailed from Zeebrugge, the Germans having a large submarine base about 10 miles up the canal at Bruges. It had been decided to enclose the whole of the Flanders coast, from Dunkirk to the Scheldt, in a sort of ring fence about 40 miles long. It was to be composed of double lines of mines, backed up by mine nets, the lines being laid parallel to the shore at a distance of between 12 and 15 miles. At either end they would curve in towards the land. The many thousands of mines would take some weeks to lay, the minelayers from Ch16 having to make several trips and being able only to deposit them at night. The placing of the nets would be undertaken by a whole fleet of little fishing drifters, each vessel being able to lay 1,000 yards of net in one operation. When this Belgian coast barrage was finally complete, it was intended that it should be patrolled by monitors and destroyers throughout the summer. Dover, with the great amount of escort and patrol work that had ever to be done, was always short of destroyers. So about 2 days before the Belgian coast operation was timed to start, a division of 4 M-class destroyers from the Harwich force was sent to assist. These 4 ships were the Media, Commander George L.D. Gibbs, the Melpomene, Lieutenant Commander Hubert de Burgh, Milne, Lieutenant Commander Hugh R. Troop, and Murray, Lieutenant Commander Taffrail Dorling. On the afternoon of April the 23rd, the minelayers Princess Margaret, Orvieto, Biarritz, and Paris sailed from Sheerness under the escort of 8 other destroyers from Harwich. The minelayers were all converted merchant vessels, the first 2 being passenger liners. The little Biarritz and Paris will be familiar to many cross-channel passengers. They arrived off the Belgian coast soon after 4 a.m. on April the 24th and started to lay their mines, completing the job at 7:30 and then returning to Sheerness to embark more. We, the party from Dunkirk, my own ship being the Murray, detached thither from Harwich and sailed before dawn. We formed quite a respectable armada. In the van went 6 paddle minesweepers, ex-pleasure steamers, which in peace took seasick trippers at so much a time between London, Southend, Margate, Clacton, Brighton, Worthing, and a dozen other watering places. Being a very shallow draught, they were useful craft, and with their sweeps out were clearing a way for the rest of us to pass. We were, so to speak, treading on virgin ground. Behind the sweepers came the 4 M-class destroyers, steaming for us at the dismal speed of 9 knots. Astern of us again, fading into the distance on the horizon, came the long lines of ordinary little fishing drifters, who were to lay the mine nets. They were manned for the most part by their ordinary fishing crews, and commanded by their own skippers, each division being led by an R.N.R. lieutenant, and the whole bunch by an admiral, in the shape of a retired Captain R.N. They had homely names: Girl Ethel, Clover Bank, Au Fait, Boy Charlie, Try Again, and the like. To return, however, to the morning of April the 24th, 1916. Our day had started at about 2:30 a.m. We were to be out all night, the whole of which I must spend on the bridge. So at about 2 p.m., as there was nothing particular going on, I retired to the chart house for a nap, leaving the officer of the watch in charge. At about 2:45, I was suddenly wakened by a messenger pulling at my shoulder, the ringing of alarm gongs, and the rattle of the engine room telegraphs as the ship increased speed. "It's enemy destroyer, sir," said the man, his voice very excited. It was. Arriving on the bridge with a rush, I could see about 9,000 yards away towards the shore the slim shapes of 3 grey vessels steaming in our direction. They were travelling at full speed, throwing up water on either side of their sharp stems in white plume-like bow waves. They were evidently about to attack our drifters at work on their nets, about a mile shoreward of where we were patrolling. The Medea, Murray, and Melpomene were in our company, in the order named, the Milne having been detached to hunt for a submarine. Our men were at action stations and the guns ready. We were working up to full speed with the stoke-hold fans roaring, and followed the Media as she swung around and made for the nearest gap in the line of mine nets. The waves at our sterns mounted higher and higher as we gradually increased to 30 knots. It was wonderful to feel the old ship really moving at last. Ashton, the engineer lieutenant commander, was driving her all he knew. The enemy, seeing our approach, altered course until they were steering about west-southwest, parallel to the coast. The range dropped rapidly to 8,000 yards, to 7,500. Then I suddenly saw the orange flashes rippling down their sides. It was curious to realize that we were being fired at, that even now a covey of hostile shell were driving through the air towards us. I felt not exactly nervous, but intensely excited, anxious to close the range. Their first salvos fell a good 600 yards short. Their seconds splashed into the sea all round us, projectiles seeming to whir and to whine in all directions. We were not hit, but the shooting was too close to be pleasant. Steaming at full speed through the gap in the nets and past a drifter reeling drunkenly in our wash, we turned onto a slightly converging course to the enemy at a range of about 6,500 yards. It seemed absurdly long, the targets very small, impossible for our guns to hit. The Media's 3-4-inch flamed out as she straightened out on her course. We steamed through the brown haze of her cordite smoke, with the sweetest smell of it in our nostrils. "Shall we commence, sir?" asked the sub-control officer. Intent on conning the ship, I nodded over my shoulder. There was a crash, a sheet of flame, and the hot stench of burning cordite as our guns opened fire. My recollections of what happened during the next 35 minutes or so are rather hazy. I was far too busy conning the ship and watching the next ahead to take much notice of details. But in between the reports of our own and our neighbours' guns, one heard the whee, whee of passing shell and a peculiar purring sound as they fell short and ricocheted. The sea seemed to be vomiting spray fountains, almost as if some giant was flinging handful after handful of huge pebbles into a pond. It seemed surprising we were not hit. Occasionally, glancing momentarily towards the enemy, soon at a range of about 5,000 yards, I noticed shell splashes all round them. Comforting, very comforting. We were using every ounce of steam we had to close into a decisive range. The Germans, however, were steaming as fast or faster, zigzagging to avoid being hit, gradually edging away towards the land. We saw in the after part of the second ship in the enemy line a dull reddish glow, a cloud of black smoke and a rush of white steam. One of our shells had hit and burst. Her speed dropped, her friends closed in and started to circle around her. We had been in action for nearly 40 minutes, and by this time were well inside the line of our drifters. Indeed, when we afterwards worked it out on the chart, we discovered we'd reached a position within about 10,000 yards of the shore. I recollect that the sun was behind us, so that every detail of the low, sandy coast was visible to the naked eye. Looking through glasses, one could even count the windows in the buildings on the seafront at Blankenberg. We'd done what we set out to do, which was to prevent the enemy from interfering with our drifters. There was no sense in going closer. Our helms went over. We started to steam out to sea as fast as we could leg it. Then the fun began. The 8 miles of sand dunes from Nock through Zeebrugge to Blankenberg contained, as we afterwards discovered, 14 batteries mounting 54 guns. 4 12-inch, 8 11-inch, 8 8-inch, 12 6-inch, 4 5-inch, and 18 4-inch. I will not pretend that every weapon of this varied and formidable collection of artillery opened fire upon us on that unforgettable afternoon. I will confine myself to saying that the moment we turned our stems towards the land, at least 5 miles of the coast started to wink in and out with red gun flashes. Within a few seconds, we were receiving the full attention of a fair proportion of those 54 pieces of ordnance, varying in size from 12-inch downwards. We could tell that from the size of the splashes and waterspouts. People say that one cannot hear a shell until it's passed, but it was certainly not true on this occasion. They roared at us like trains tearing through a station, whistled, whined and hummed. They splashed and burst on striking the water, the splinters driving in all directions. Geysers of all sizes and shapes leapt out of the sea all around us, their white plumes reaching higher than our masthead. I saw a great upheaval of water rear itself out of the sea within 3 feet of our stern, waited for a crash as it came in through the side to wreck the steering gear. But no, nothing happened. The ship steamed on. A fountain leapt out of the water under our bows and cast its shadow across the bridge and forecastle. We actually steamed through the tumbling spray of it, suddenly to find ourselves wet and blinded and coughing with the bitter smell of high explosive. rather like the smell of an expended squib. The blue sea was pockmarked with large circular areas where shell had pitched, with here and there patches of scummy-looking discoloration where others had burst. They looked exactly as if someone had been emptying large buckets of ashes. It was supremely, wildly exciting, but I cannot pretend that I liked it. Nobody liked it. If one of those great things hit us and exploded, we might crumple in two, burst open. A thudding clang and a quiver warned us that we'd been hit somewhere fairly close to the bridge. Personally, I waited for what seemed minutes for a gout of flame and a shower of splinters. They never came. Looking forward, I saw a ragged hole in the steel deck of the forecastle. The shell had driven its way through 2 decks and passed out through the ship's side about 8 feet above the waterline without exploding. If that fuse had been up to its work, the whole of our forecastle gun's crews must have been killed or wounded. As it was, we merely had a large irregular-shaped hole above the waterline, which for the time being was plugged with a hammock. Within a foot of me, as I write, is a jagged lump of steel, mounted on a mahogany plinth, with a little brass plate bearing an inscription. It's a small piece of the riding bit of the Murray removed by that 6-inch shell. The whistling, howling, and screeching continued, and the spray fountains persisted. "God damn those sons of bitches," I heard the coxswain mutter. I thought that perhaps a splinter had found lodgment in Chief Petty Officer William Yule's well-favoured anatomy. But it was nothing so serious. The top of our bridge was uncovered. The wind of a passing projectile had merely removed his cap. He looked at me with a wry smile, his face streaked with perspiration, rather redder than usual. "'Struth, sir," he said, "this is no place for a married man." It wasn't. Soon after the shore guns had opened, we'd started to dodge this way and that. At the same time, I'd signalled to the engine room to make smoke. In point of fact, in my agitation, I'd pressed the gong once too often or too little, which meant negative make smoke. Ashton, however, had his head up the engine room hatch and realised what was wanted. Before long, the transparent haze at our funnel tops started to darken. A few seconds later, a cloud of inky blackness, so thick and so black that it seemed as if one could have walked upon it, was pouring out of the funnels and rolling away astern. I think that it saved us. Still dodging, we withdrew under the smoke screen. We'd been in action with the enemy destroyers from 3 to 340. It was now 350. Then we noticed the Melpomene, which had been in action with us, gradually dropping astern. We put it down to a temporary loss of steam, which could soon be rectified. It was not until she made a signal asking for help that we realised that she had been badly hit. We were told afterwards that at about 340, she'd been hit in the engine room by a ricocheting 4-inch shell, one of the last fired by the enemy destroyers before we broke out of action. This projectile, entering the ship sideways, had happily not burst. If it had, the ship would probably have been lost. As it was, it made a hole in the ship's side below the waterline, through which the water poured in a torrent. The engine room filled up, and the men were finally forced to abandon it. But for 20 minutes the ship had still managed to steam with her turbines awash, and then entirely under water. Her speed dropped fast. At last she came to a standstill. The sea was flat calm, and the Milne, seeing Melapomene's predicament, at once went alongside the port side of her damaged sister with the idea of towing her into safety. All the destroyers of the Harwich force carried 2 shackles, 25 fathoms, of chain cable aft, ready for shackling onto the end of a towing wire to assist a damaged consort. On this occasion, however, through no fault of her captain's, the Milne had bad luck. A loop of the cable was cropped by accident over her port propeller whilst it was being shackled onto the Melpomene's wire. The revolving screw caught up in the loop and tangled it round the propeller shaft and the air bracket until it was tied in a tight knot, and the propeller came to a standstill. One of her screws was thus out of action until she went into dry dock. The Media, Commander G.L.D. Gibbs, signalling to us to go ahead to find our way out through the mine nets, thereupon went alongside the starboard side of the Melpomene to tow her clear, the 3 ships thus forming a sandwich with the Melpomene in the middle. For 25 minutes or so they steamed thus, while the Murray went ahead of them to find a gap. But the enemy destroyers had seen what had happened, for at 4:30, looking astern, we sighted their white bow waves again as they steamed towards us at full speed. From that moment, all sense of time seemed to vanish. I recollect signalling to the Media to tell her the Germans were approaching, and the Media replying, "Please show us the gap in the nets." I went ahead, hailed a drifter, found out where the gap was, and told the others. The next thing was a series of gun flashes from the enemy, then about 8,000 yards astern, and several pillars of silvery spray in the water all round the 3 destroyers tied in a bunch. They must have presented a tempting target. More salvos fell, rather closer this time. Before long, someone would be hit. There was only one thing to do, and that quickly. The Murray must make a smokescreen under the sterns of the other 3. I didn't feel very happy about it. It would be a matter of ourselves alone against 3 Germans, until the only other undamaged ship, the Media, came into action with us. Our telegraphs rattled over to full speed. The helm went over, and signalling to the engine room for smoke, we dashed past the 3 ships, still lashed together, our heavy wash causing them considerable inconvenience, and carried away some of their wires. But even as we passed, more clusters of shell fell about them. Straightening out under their sterns and pouring a dense cloud of black smoke into our funnels, we opened fire on the approaching enemy at a range of about 6,000 yards. We saw the splashes of our falling shells somewhere near them, whereupon they again turned to a course more or less parallel to the coast and transferred their attention to us. It was distinctly unpleasant until the Media cast off from the Melpomene and came into action ahead of us. 2 against 3 was not quite such long odds. To give the Melpomene and Milne a chance of getting well clear, it was necessary that we drive the Germans well in towards the coast. This we proceeded to do, while a monitor further out to sea, the Prince Eugene, cocked her 12-inch guns in the air and let them have a dose of shrapnel until they were out of range. Our second little battle lasted from about 4:40 to 4:45, at ranges of between 5,000 to 8,000 yards. I think the enemy were hit once or twice, though they never succeeded in hitting us. Firing very fast, they seemed to be missing by fathoms. It was when we turned to come out again, shortly after 5 o'clock, that the shore batteries again let loose. We adopted our old tactics, zigzagging and making thick smoke. And though plenty of large projectiles sailed down into the sea all around us, to raise their terrifying water spouts, we were never actually hit. The media was not so lucky. I saw a flash of reddish golden flame and a puff of black smoke, and a shell struck fair and square into her quarterdeck. Then another struck close alongside the funnels. I waited with my heart in my mouth, thinking that she must inevitably be damaged, that we should have to go and do a sort of death or glory exploit under a withering fire and tow her out of action. To my heartfelt relief, she didn't wobble on her course. She steamed on at full speed, and in another 5 or 6 minutes it was all over and we were safe. The media had been hit 3 times. A shell bursting in the wardroom where men were handing up ammunition to the afterguns killed 2 poor fellows and wounded several more. It had also caused damage to our stern, while rendering the wardroom uninhabitable. I went on board her when we arrived in harbour. It was a nasty sight. Blood splashed over her deck and the white enamelled bulkhead. The ship's side perforated in places like a colander. How the detonations of that shell didn't explode the magazine and wreck the ship, I do not pretend to know. As for ourselves, we were merely hit once by that single 6-inch shell during the first phase of the action. That we were not struck more often was due to sheer good luck, to Ashton's smoke screens, and to the fact that we zigzagged like a snipe. 45 miles of coast had concentrated its guns upon us.